Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habarigani. This is Sister Thade with Freedom Now's agenda for this Farce of You Lie Saturday, July 4, 2026, with the central theme of slavery, bringing you a full program with 3 guest interviews. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kaboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Patricia Seed, professor of history at UC Irvine and author of the book Sails and Shadows, How the Portuguese Opened the Atlantic and Launched the Slave Trade. Then, Dr. Horne interviews Sean Butorac, assistant professor of politics at Fairfield University in Connecticut and author of the book Slave Rebellions and the Making of the Modern Prison. And to close out this Freedom Now Hour of Power, Dr. Horne interviews Jeremy D. Popkin, the William T. Bryant Chair, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Kentucky at Lexington, and author of the book, The First Emancipation, The Forgotten History of Abolition in Revolutionary France. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Shirley Scott, George Benson, Madison Calley, Jay Dilla, Duke Ellington, Alice Coltrane, and more. We stand in solidarity with our Venezuelan, Cuban, Palestinian, Congolese, Sudanese, Ghanaian, Lebanese, and Syrian sisters and brothers who are defending themselves from Western imperialism, its bombing and sanctions and environmental disasters. So this hour, sit back, phone a friend to tune in, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Molweni Ekaya. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with Freedom Now's weekly African Drumbeat historical calendar with significant dates and events that reflect the struggle of the oppressed for the week of July 4th. July 4th, 1930. The Nation of Islam was founded by Master Fard Muhammad. The nation continues in the tradition of African nationalist religious movements which seek to spiritually and politically better the conditions of African prisoners of the European slavocracies and wars on Africa. The Nation of Islam has produced great leaders such as Minister Malcolm X, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and Minister Louis Farrakhan, and more importantly has transformed thousands of men from predators of the community to soldiers in the struggle of righteousness against Western decadence. July 5th, 1962. Algeria gains independence after an 8-year guerrilla war where over 1 million Africans gave their lives against French colonialism. Ahmad Ben Bella and Frantz Fanon are two among many whose spirit and ideological skills became role models for the continued liberation movements that occurred, best immortalized in the film Battle of Algiers, where the twin evils of colonialism and neocolonialism are exposed. July 6th, late 19th century, Sarah Noir, warrior queen of the Asnas, who in early 1999, through brilliant tactical maneuvering and the creative promulgation of her reputation as a witch demoness, successfully defended her African kingdom from the advancing forces of French capitalism. July 7th, 1954. TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union, which was the movement of national liberation of the microstate of Tanzania, begins the mass protest confrontation stage of struggle against British colonialism through countrywide strikes and boycotts. July 7th, 1975. Melba Hernandez, a Cuban guerrilla and a member of the July 26 movement with Fidel Castro, helps launch the Cuban Revolution. Melba was a founding member of the Cuban Communist Party and was brutally tortured by the Batista neocolonial government. July 9th, 1972, more than 3,000 Chicano workers, 85% of whom were Chicana women, went on strike against the Farah Pants Company in El Paso, Texas. They walked out demanding a union. July 10th, 1875. Mary McLeod Bethune was born in Maysville, South Carolina, one of 17 children of Samuel and Patsy McLeod, former slaves. Mary worked in the cotton fields with her family. She founded the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for Negro Girls, now known as Bethune-Cookman College, in 1904. And she served as president from 1904 to 1942 and from 1946 to 1947. She was a leader in the Black Women's Club movement and served as president of the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the founders of National Council of Negro Women. Vice president of the NAACP, was awarded the Haitian Medal of Honor and Merit, that country's highest award, and in Liberia, she received the honor of Commander of the Order of the Star of Africa. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. Streaming live on www.kpfk.org. If you have any questions or comments, email us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And in the language of resistance in South Africa, as the listening audience, join us in our chant for freedom. Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Patricia Seed, Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, and author of the book Sails and Shadows, How the Portuguese Opened the Atlantic and Launched the Slave Trade. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now. KPFK Los Angeles, Patricia Seed.
Yes, good morning.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. First of all, the fact that most people in the Spanish-speaking world are not familiar with the prior history of the Portuguese in the Atlantic. They're familiar with Columbus, maybe, and the Spanish settlement of the Americas, and maybe they know a little bit about Brazil, but they don't know about the history that preceded it, nor that the fact that this tremendous sailing expedition and series of discoveries that made it possible to cross the Atlantic were intimately linked with the slave trade. In other words, you can't separate the two of them out.
Mm-hmm. And what about the overall role of Portugal in the African slave trade in comparison to its peers? Speaking of Britain, France, and Spain
the
in
Spanish were the
particular.
ones who began what became the foundations of the Atlantic slave trade. They began it originally following a Muslim Christian tradition of battles in Spain and in Portugal during the late Middle Ages up until about 1492. And initially, when they started down the coast of West Africa, they thought that they were going to meet all kinds of Arab ships that are already sailing there, and then only later discovered that there weren't any. So they began by launching attacks that they called by the word conquest, conquista. And this had a tradition in Iberia, in both the Spanish and the Portuguese world, which meant that you were justified in taking prisoners who were of a different religion, namely Muslims. And this worked out fine as they initially began their journeys down the coast of Africa. But at some point, and this is when they reached the area south of the Sahara, they began to encounter populations that were not Muslim. And this is particularly to the south of the Senegal River, which is considerably north of today's Dakar. And then they were faced with a conundrum because there was no historical or religious legitimacy to capturing people and taking them as slaves. So what Prince Henry did was to seek permission, to ask for the Pope to bless his ability to capture people and enslave people who were not Muslim. And this was the beginning of a kind of a rupture, because it no longer meant that they were fighting people who were religious enemies and with whom there were all kinds of rules governing how you exchange prisoners and what ransom was and what people could be held as slaves and what people could be redeemed for ransom. In other words, there was a whole diplomatic apparatus that surrounded the traditional Iberian concept of conquest. But what happened when Prince Henry discovered all of these people who were not Muslims, who were animists or people who had some kind of religion that they didn't recognize, and that was clearly not Muslim, Prince Henry decided that he was going to find a way to enslave these people and remove them back to Portugal. So he went to and he got permission from a pope. He basically bribed one of these very corrupt 15th century popes and said, I need a declaration saying that it's okay for me to enslave these people. Pope promptly went around along with it. But the problem was that there was a great deal of opposition to enslaving people who weren't Muslims in Portugal. And so he attached a threatening note to the end when he promulgated the Pope's decree. He established a threatening note saying, if you dare go against me in this, I'm going to see that you are punished for it. That was the first step. That was the reason of justifying people who simply because they were located on the African coast, they were Black, and he was going to enslave them. The next step came a few years later when he decided that it was not enough because the tradition of Iberian conquest and taking of slaves involved an opportunity for freedom. People could buy their way out, they could ransom their way out, they could exchange themselves for somebody else, forcibly exchanged in some cases. You're going to go service my place as a slave. And this was all going on at a time before Miguel de Cervantes was actually held as a prisoner under the conditions of traditional Iberian Christian Muslim warfare. But he was released, he was ransomed, the traditional old rules held. But the traditional old rules were not holding, and the possibility of redemption still existed. So Prince Henry went back to the Pope and said, I need to make this permanent. I need to make the taking of these people from Africa, whom I'm going to enslave, bring to Portugal and enslave, and I need to make that permanent. So, of course, the Pope, these extremely corrupt 15th century popes, simply said, all right, yes, you can enslave them, and you can enslave them in perpetuity. And that's the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. When you begin to remove when the Portuguese began to remove large numbers of people from Africa and bring them back to Portugal and hold them in perpetual slavery. That's the foundation of that slave trade. So that when England came along and Spain came along, they were simply following the navigational routes to areas that contained both gold and slaves. And so they began by enslaving people. But under English law, which is very different than Iberian law, under English law, people became property. In other words, they were never human beings. They were pieces of property to be exchanged for money, it wasn't that the Portuguese didn't do this, but this whole notion of slaves as property, as being owned, right? Not as existence as separate souls, is something that characterized English slavery and English slavery in the New World in a particularly brutal way, and which explains in part the refusal of slave owners, English slave owners in the New World, their refusal to allow people access to the Bible, and the refusal to allow them to learn to read. So they struck off, they eliminated one of the exit forms that had existed. Now that exit form nominally existed within Portuguese slavery, and in Portuguese, when they begin to introduce large numbers of slaves into Brazil, beginning with the advent of the sugar plantation, this is circa 1570, 1580, that's when they began to increase the pace of slave owning in the New World. And the Portuguese took more people out of Africa than anybody else, and they just sent them into the meat grinder and the sugarcane fields of northeastern Brazil.
Could you elaborate upon the role of Angola, Southwest Africa, in your narrative, not least because a significant percentage of those now dubbed African American happen to be of Angolan ancestry, as represented, I'm afraid to say, by the fact that the leading prison in Louisiana, which houses a disproportionate number of Black people is called Angola, for example.
Angola, yeah. Angola is an interesting case because the Portuguese only reached Angola during the 1470s. And when they got there, they found sort of two different types of populations. They found large settled populations to the north, and to the south, they found far fewer people. They found small communities of fishermen. And they began to practice what they had done elsewhere in the world, which was to kidnap. And sometimes people say, well, maybe these people went along willingly. That's doubtful. But they began to capture people in order to be able to bring them back to Portugal, to teach them Portuguese language, and then to send them back to Angola, where they would act as intermediaries to help capture people, or to help serve as intermediaries in actually collecting people for the slave trade. So one of the things that the Portuguese did was that they realized that they were a small number, that they had relatively few people compared to, say, a large country like France. So what they did was to enlist collaborators who would carry out the difficult task of actually capturing people from either the enemies of the people who resided along the coast, or people who resided in the interior whom they were able to defeat militarily. So there were people who resided along the coast who entered into these agreements of complicity where they would profit from the sale of other tribes and of other people and sell them to the Portuguese, who would then transport them to the New World. And yeah, that became simply a very convenient way for them to engage in the slave trade.
Well, Patricia Seed, Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, author of the book Sails and Shadows, How the Portuguese Opened the Atlantic and Launched the Slave Trade. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Sean Butorac, Assistant Professor of Politics at Fairfield University in Connecticut, and author of the book Slave Rebellions and the Making of the Modern Prison. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Sean Butorac.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
So as a graduate student, I had the opportunity to develop and teach my own course on the development of the American criminal legal system. And one of the things that I chose to include on that syllabus in the back half of the course was moments of resistance to the development of the carceral state, beginning with slave rebellions and working all the way up through Black Lives Matter. And what I sort of noticed in teaching the course were continuities in the way that the state responded to those moments of resistance by codifying new forms of racial violence in law and really naturalizing and routinizing those forms of racial violence. And so, I think today often when we talk about continuities between slavery and prisons, we're drawn to parallels between slave courts and slave patrols and modern carceral institutions like the police and courts. And what I saw and sort of part of the story that hadn't been told were continuities in the way that the state responds to these moments of wide-scale resistance by engineering new modes of violence, new modes of repression to sort of stave off those forms of resistance.
Mm-hmm. And why do you focus on South Carolina?
So I think, South Carolina offers a really important window into understanding the transatlantic development of these racial categories, of the legal institutions that eventually give way to the modern prison system. And so, it was Barbados that eventually settled Carolina and then South Carolina, and that were really the originators of the earliest and most influential slave codes that were eventually propagated throughout much of the US. And so I felt that, in order to tell the sort of long arc history that I wanted to develop, that Barbados and South Carolina really offered a powerful window into that kind of longer history.
Mm-hmm. And what about the 1739 Stonewall Revolt of the enslaved in South Carolina? What role does it play?
Yeah. So when we think about, the Stono Rebellion, and this is a recurring theme in the book, is, in contrast to moments like the Haitian Revolution, which have been more deeply and widely studied, and I think rightfully so, right? This is such a sort of key moment. Um, that we've spent less time thinking about rebellions that were preempted or were violently repressed, as was the case in the Stono Rebellion, but that still really played a constitutive role in looking at the ideas and institutions that this book traces over time. So if we think about, for example, how and why the law came to select and legitimate certain kinds of anti-Black violence. If we think about the making of the Black criminal as a concept that is embedded in law and in legal institutions, if we think about the making of whiteness, that these categories and institutions are being shaped from below through these moments of wide-scale resistance. So that even right when these liberatory struggles fail, they still have a transformative effect on the world, and that for us to then have a fuller picture of that history, of that long arc from slavery to prisons, we also have to attend to these moments that, on the one hand, from the perspective of the struggle, from the perspective of resistance, right, fell short of their goals. They nonetheless had a transformative effect on the sort of trajectory of American political development and the development of racial categories that we have inherited today.
Mm-hmm. And what about the 1822 revolt in South Carolina, symbolized by Denmark Vesey? What role does it play?
Yeah, Denmark Vesey is, I think, a fascinating historical figure, one who is part of an emerging kind of early Black diaspora, and who I think anticipates many of the sort of Black nationalist politics that later follow. And that when we think about somebody like Vesey, that it's not just the ideas that Vesey anticipated, but also when we look at the state's response to preempting the Vesey Rebellion, that this is a moment in which you have this long summer of trials, and that the whole sort of persecution of the rebellion is very much couched in the language of law, in legal institutions, in trying to figure out the right kinds of violence that are suited to addressing these moments of resistance to slavery. And so what the Vesey Rebellion helps us see, I think, are these ongoing moments of adaptation in which white supremacy and racial capitalism are challenged in new ways. And so they have to adapt. They have to find new ideas, new forms of violence that are suited to preserving these structures and these ideas of race.
What about the 1866 construction of the state penitentiary? What role does that play in your story?
Yeah, so the South Carolina penitentiary, like many Southern states, prior to the abolition of slavery, South Carolina did not have a state penitentiary. And so this is a moment in which we see, in contrast to something like the Vesey Rebellion or the Stono Rebellion, which very much relies on, giving the prerogative to engage in racial violence to everyday white people, right, including poor whites. We're starting to see now the consolidation of that prerogative to engage in racial violence with state actors, with state institutions. And yet, right, the way in which the penitentiary selects and legitimates certain kinds of racial violence to now, right, police and to incarcerate a predominantly Black prison population is very much indebted to this longer legal tradition of figuring out how to preserve slavery against the changing tides of resistance. But what's so fascinating, I think, about the South Carolina penitentiary is that as much as it's sort of wrapped up in the afterlife of slavery, prison administrators are also trying to figure out how to create what they perceive to be a modern penal institution. And so they're looking, not just to how to adapt, sort of the ideas and institutions of slavery, but they're also looking to northern and to Midwestern prisons across the US. They're looking to a kind of global emerging science of penalty that is taking shape across the West during this period. And this becomes the kind of through line, right, to the modern prison system today, I argue, is this push and pull, right, between ideas and institutions that are rooted in slavery and in resistance to slavery. And on the other hand, right, this enduring preoccupation with creating a kind of ostensibly modern, racially neutral criminal legal system.
Mm-hmm. And that's followed by the 1876 revolt against Reconstruction, that is to say, this brief moment of democratic promise in South Carolina and Dixie generally. What role does that play in your story?
Yeah, I think, the collapse of Reconstruction from 1876 onwards is a really fascinating kind of window into that relationship that I just described between, on the one hand, moving back toward, ideas and institutions that are rooted deeply in slavery. And on the other hand, this preoccupation with creating a modern criminal legal system that, however superficially, appears racially neutral. And so South Carolina is this fascinating example, right? Because folks focus so much on, the ascendance of convict leasing across the South after the collapse during and after the collapse of Reconstruction. But what actually ends up happening in South Carolina is that convict leasing is actually relatively short-lived. It's a remarkably unstable institution, kind of logistically and financially for the state of South Carolina. And so these prison administrators, right, actually persuade state officials to abandon convict leasing and to move back toward, right, prison plantations that are very reminiscent of the slave plantation in their structure, in their day-to-day operation. And yet all of this is being couched in modern ideas of crime and punishment. And so what the collapse of Reconstruction helps us see is this sort of combination, right? This hybrid of new and old, of the kind of afterlife of slavery, suffusing modern ideas of crime and punishment that by the turn of the 20th century give way to the kind of foundation of the modern criminal legal system.
Now, thus far, you've mentioned resistance. Could you give us an overriding analysis of the role of resistance in struggling against this prison industrial complex, if I can use that term?
Absolutely. So I use two sort of terms in this book. One is resistance, to refer to the wider field of, ideas, discourses, everyday activities that free and enslaved people might engage in, right? To resist the institution of slavery, to resist the exploitative structure of racial capitalism. And those forms of resistance were, individual and collective. They were small and large. They were seen and unseen. They were heard and unheard. And what I focus primarily on in the book are what I describe as rebellions. So moments like the Stono Rebellion, the Vesey Rebellion, rebellions within the South Carolina Penitentiary. And what I try to sort of draw out of those rebellions is the really constitutive role that they play in the making of racial categories. Concepts like the Black criminal that we've long inherited, concepts like whiteness that still structure American political life and American political thought, but also how they shape institutions. So thinking about systems of law, and in particular, right, how resistance leads law to, and lawmakers, to determine what kinds and what degrees of violence are best suited to addressing and limiting those forms of resistance. And so really the book is trying to draw out this kind of interactive and mutually constitutive relationship between resistance and the forms of state repression that continually kind of cyclically respond to those ever-changing tactics of resistance and the moments of rebellion that spring out of those everyday forms of resistance.
Finally, Sean Butorac, author of the book Slave Rebellions and the Making of the Modern Prison, you've alluded to this previously, but perhaps you could elaborate. That is to say, what do you mean by the idea that whiteness is consolidated via anti-Black violence, whereas Blackness is stigmatized as a condition of criminality?
Sure. I think, what this book helps us see is by going all the way back to, the mid 17th century, by looking to a place like Barbados, where originally, right, phenotypically white indentured servants legally, materially, shared much more in common with African enslaved peoples than they did with white elites. That there were moments of interracial resistance in the mid 17th century. And so the question became, right, and always remained, how to fracture potential relationships of solidarity between different exploited groups. Now, certainly, right, the sort of racialized exploitation of African enslaved peoples was fundamentally different from the class exploitation of white indentured servants. And yet there were these very potent axes of solidarity between these different groups. We saw something similar in South Carolina with the relationships of solidarity between indigenous peoples and Black enslaved peoples. And so what Barbadian lawmakers do is they look for ways to fracture those potential relationships of solidarity. And one way they do that is by creating the first comprehensive slave code and the first comprehensive servant codes in an English colony. And what that does is it, for example, says to white indentured servants, if you capture an escaped enslaved person, we will pay out the remainder of your contract, right? You are freed from servitude. And so what unfolds from this initial process is that the making of whiteness, right, as a racial category, is really built around the prerogative to engage in racial violence, to police Black bodies. And so when we think today, for example, about white vigilantism, and the way in which the legal system, if it doesn't overtly condone that violence, right, it supports it and reproduces it by ensuring that those individuals don't face legal consequences for their actions, by taking the violence of the law into their own hands. the way that we can make sense of that today is by looking across this longer historical arc, by looking at the way in which, class divisions among whites were papered over, right, were ameliorated by entrenching this prerogative among white men of varying social, political, and economic standing. At the end of the day, what they were able to share in common, what the law provided as a means for them to build up whiteness and to build relationships of solidarity between these whites of very divergent standing, right, was this prerogative to engage in anti-Black violence.
Well, Sean Kim Butorac, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
And up next, Dr. Horne interviews Jeremy D. Popkin about his book, The First Emancipation, The Forgotten History of Abolition in Revolutionary France.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jeremy D. Popkin, William T. Bryant Chair, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, and author of the book, The First Emancipation, The Forgotten History of Abolition in Revolutionary France. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Jeremy D. Popkin.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be back in Southern California, where I grew up, if only in virtual form.
Oh, where'd you grow up?
I went to high school in San Diego and a year of college at UC San Diego, and later graduated from Berkeley, which I know is not in Southern California.
Well, welcome back.
Thank you.
So why did you produce this book?
I thought this was a much neglected aspect of the history of the French Revolution and a much neglected aspect of the history of the movement for the abolition of slavery in the world. And I wanted to show how these two stories were connected in a very dramatic way during the years of the French Revolution. I wanted to give readers a way of understanding how France came to be the first country in the world to abolish slavery as and to declare it a violation of natural human rights, but also to tell the story of how France's government under Napoleon made it the only country to reinstitute slavery after it had been abolished, and how the Black populations of France's colonies resisted that attempt to take away the rights that they had gained.
Now, speaking of that latter point, what is the role of Haiti in your story?
Well, Haiti, when the French Revolution began in 1789, what's now Haiti was the most valuable overseas colony of any European country. It was called Saint-Domingue. There were nearly as many enslaved Black people there in 1789 as there were in the 13 American states, and it produced half of the world's supply of coffee and sugar, which, as we know, are two commodities without which civilized life is unimaginable. So it was a very important part of the French Empire, a very substantial part of the French economy. And it was, of course, an obvious test of whether the French revolutionaries really meant what they said when they passed their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. When they did not abolish slavery in Saint-Domingue, they set the stage for the largest slave revolt that the world had ever seen, which began in August of 1791. But even the French advocates of abolition at that moment were not prepared to simply concede the colony to the Black insurrection. And so part of the story in my book is the very complicated story of how the French revolutionaries who did support abolition nevertheless tried to reconcile it with keeping control of the colony, and the rather surprising story of how they after most of those early abolitionists had in fact been sidelined in revolutionary politics and executed, how the French revolutionary government nevertheless, rather surprisingly, eventually decided to that it had to concede freedom to the black populations in its colonies. Sorry for that long and convoluted sentence.
Oh, sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's it.
Okay. What role did the Catholic Church play in your story?
The Catholic Church does not really play a large role in the story. Official Catholic doctrine, not only in France, but throughout the world up to the time of the French Revolution, was that slavery was legitimate. It could be defended as long as one of the ostensible purposes of capturing Black people in Africa and bringing them to the Americas was to convert them to the true faith of Christianity. As far as the French Catholic Church was concerned, once the revolution got going, it became so involved in a struggle for its own survival during the revolution that as an institution, it was not in any position to influence the debate about abolition. Having said that, there are a few prominent Catholic priests who did participate in the abolition movement. The most famous of them is the Abbé Henri Grégoire, and he is now buried in the Pantheon in Paris as one of the figures most honored by the French Revolution. And he was a consistent supporter of rights for people of all races, but he was also rather a cautious abolitionist. He didn't play a leading role in February of 1794 when the historic decree abolishing slavery was passed.
Now, you mentioned a moment or two ago the role of Napoleon, and you talked about him in the context of the overthrow of the abolitionist decree and the return of slavery.
That's right.
What were the mechanics of the return of slavery? That is to say, let's take Guadeloupe and Martinique, for example. I assume the enslavers did not flee. I assume that once this decree was overthrown, they returned and at gunpoint forced the Africans to resume being slaves. Tell us more about how that unfolded.
Well, actually, each one of the French island colonies had a different history during the revolutionary period. In Martinique, Martinique was occupied by the British in 1793, and they remained in control of it until they made a treaty with Napoleon in 1802 and returned it. So slavery was never abolished there, and the white French plantation owners, which included the family of Josephine, Napoleon's wife, they were able to stay there and continue running their plantations, and some of them would have been happier to remain under British protection than to go back being part of France. Guadeloupe is another story. There, the French had sent an official named Victor Hugues, who took control of the island in 1794, and he set up sort of a one-man rule of his own. He didn't pay much attention to orders from France. And one of the things he did was to say, I'm not going to fully implement the abolition decree. He did, however, execute many of the white slave owners and drove the rest of them to flee the island. And he created an army and navy made up of black soldiers and black sailors. So you could say Guadeloupe was kind of halfway between abolishing slavery and maintaining it. When Napoleon came back in, Victor Hugues had been ousted earlier, and there was a kind of, a state of tremendous political confusion there. Napoleon was able to land his army there, take back control of the island, murder the leaders of the resistance movement there, and force the population back into slavery. In Saint-Domingue, however, you had a third trajectory. There, after the abolition decree, the Toussaint Louverture, who had been fighting against the French, came over to their side, allied himself with the French Republican government, and soon was elevated to the position of commander-in-chief of the French army there, and then military governor of the colony. So he was really in charge of Saint-Domingue, theoretically still recognizing the authority of the French government, but acting more and more like an independent ruler. And he sometimes contradicted official French policy. So Napoleon had considerable support in France for the idea that Toussaint Louverture had really gotten too big for his britches, and that Saint-Domingue needed to be brought under French control. But Toussaint Louverture had also had a chance to prepare the black population to fight to defend its freedom. And there, Napoleon's expedition was defeated. They did succeed in capturing Toussaint Louverture and taking him back to France, where he died in prison. But at the end of 1803, the French army there had to surrender. And on January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared its independence as the second independent former colonial nation in the Americas, the first independent black republic in the Americas under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines.
Any other details to add about Toussaint, who our audience is definitely interested in knowing more about?
Well, I think one thing readers will learn from my book, often if you get a sort of one-paragraph description of the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint, you get the idea that he spent most of his revolutionary career heroically fighting against the French. We need to understand that he spent most of the revolutionary years heroically fighting as a general and commander in the French army, and that it was only, I would say, reluctantly that he found himself fighting against Napoleon. He, in many ways, was a skilled politician within the French Republic during the 1790s before Napoleon took power. Readers will see how much effort he put into influencing politics back in France. He wrote pamphlets, issued decrees, sent representatives to argue his case, and tried very hard, actually, to succeed within the French system rather than fighting against it. So I think that will be perhaps the most surprising aspect of what I have to say about Toussaint in the book.
I noticed you also mentioned Biassou, Jorge Biassou, who had worked alongside Toussaint, a fellow African, of course, but then they split, and Biassou winds up in Florida.
Yes, another historian, friend of mine, David Gegas, has called him the first person to retire to Florida in history. But he will not appear very much in this book. I have written several other books about the Haitian Revolution, and he is a major figure in the first years of the revolution, along with Jean-François Papillon. They are sort of the co-leaders of the insurrection in its first several years. But in this book, I did make a choice to concentrate primarily on politics in metropolitan France, and readers who want to know more about what was happening in Haiti during these years, there are a number of good books, including a couple of my own that I could recommend. One called You Are All Free, The Haitian Revolution and the Abolition of Slavery, and another one that's used in a lot of college courses called A Concise History of the Haitian Revolution. And you'll see a lot more about Biassou and Jean-François in those books.
What about the impact of abolition in France on the United States of America?
Americans followed the events in the French colonies very closely. Saint-Domingue in particular was a very important trading partner for American merchants, and news from the Caribbean reached America much more quickly than it did. It took 2 months for sailing ships to cross the Atlantic from the Caribbean to France, but less than a month to reach the east coast of the United States. So Americans certainly knew what was happening there. The news that the enslaved population had been freed in Saint-Domingue was published in many American newspapers, and it certainly alarmed white slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State at that time. But there were some American politicians who thought the United States could take advantage of what was happening there. John Adams, for example, when he was president, backed Toussaint Louverture against his rivals in Saint-Domingue, hoping to use Louverture against the French government, which was involved in the so-called quasi-war with the United States during those years.
What about the impact of abolition in France on Europe more broadly, and particularly Britain and its colonies?
The British also paid close attention to what the French were doing, and the abolition of slavery in France was one of those radical things that allowed the conservative British government to kind of influence the British public to think that the French had really gone crazy and were doing terrible things. Unfortunately, I would say the fact that the British opinion turned against the French Revolution really became a major obstacle to the British movement to abolish the slave trade. The proponents of abolishing the slave trade in Britain essentially were silenced for a number of years, and it was only after the Haitian Revolution that they were able to pick up momentum again and finally persuade the British Parliament to abolish the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in 1807. In the long run, the fact that the French had abolished slavery altogether during the Revolution, and that the result had been that their biggest colony had wound up as an independent nation, and slavery had been brought back in their other colonies, provided an argument for a different kind of model of abolition in Britain, a kind of gradual, grudging approach to abolition that finally culminated in 1833 with the passage of an abolition law that provided for a 5-year period of transition and also for compensation to the former slave owners. The French law of 1794 was particularly radical because it did not offer any compensation to the former slave owners, and it not only freed the slaves, but it made them full French citizens with all the constitutional rights of other French citizens, and several black deputies were immediately seated in the French legislature, and for 5 years, from 1794 until 1799, black legislators participated in making the laws for the whole country of France. That was another thing, of course, that Napoleon ended as soon as he came to power.
Well, Jeremy D. Popkin of the University of Kentucky, author of the book, The First Emancipation, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Well, thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Patricia Seed, Sean Butorac, Jeremy D. Popkin. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon, Sister Flora, our board op Sly, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.